Welcome to BCM, week 3 of our study in the book of Nehemiah, and we are looking at Nehemiah chapter 2. I hope that you're in a small group and prepared to discuss and think about and reflect on some questions that our student leaders are going to lead us through tonight. And Nehemiah is going to help us to think about an important question, and that question is this: what will you do while you're waiting? What will you do while you're waiting? It seems like right now we're just in a period where there's just a lot of waiting going on. We're waiting for things to change. We're waiting for things to get better. We're waiting for a time when we can meet in person. We're waiting for classes to feel a little more normal, for campus to feel a little more like the lively, exciting, exuberant place that it's always been. We're waiting to find answers to questions, and we're waiting in our lives to see how things are going to turn out. So especially at this time, it seems like we're in a time of waiting, and Nehemiah is going to help us to think about that. And we're going to see a man who plans, who prays, who prepares, and then he takes action. And he doesn't know how things are going to turn out. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know how God's plan is going to work out in his life, but he's going to go through all of these steps while he's waiting. And so as we begin in chapter 2 tonight, we need to go back first to the very last line of chapter 1, because in the last line of chapter 1, Nehemiah tells us that he was the cupbearer to the king. Now, until this point, we haven't really known what his position was. And so as he has told the story in the very first chapter that we've looked at the last 2 weeks, he's told us that this group of people came to him and told him that the city of his ancestors was in disrepair, and they were in disgrace, and their walls had been torn down, and nothing had been done about it, and it was a difficult time for them, and they were going through hard times. And so Nehemiah immediately develops a burden for these people, and the scripture says that he fasts and he prays and he weeps over the condition of this city that means so much to him, because even though his feet are in a place called Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, his heart is in Jerusalem, about 1,000 miles away. And so that's the people that he identifies with. That's what he would consider his homeland, even though he's most likely never been there yet. He feels this connection to those people, and he wants to do something about it. And so the first thing we talked about last week, he goes to God in prayer. And so he looks up to God in prayer. He looks within and he sees his own heart, and he sees that he's a sinful man, and he has things that he needs to confess to the Lord, as do all the people of the Israelites. And so as they confess, or as he confesses on their behalf, he includes himself in that. And so he looks within, and then he looks back and he sees how God has been faithful over the years and over time, and how God has brought them to the place that they are at now. And then he looks forward after he looks back, and he looks forward with confidence to what God is going to do. And then he tells us that he's the cupbearer to the king. Now, the cupbearer to the king of the Persian Empire would have been one of those good news, bad news jobs. The good news was that you were in a place of prominence and that you had a voice. And so it was a position of some prestige. You were the last person who would eat and drink the food that was served to the king. And the cupbearer's role, this is the bad news part, was that if someone had poisoned the food, then you were the one to die instead of the king. So while it gave you access to the king, you still recognized that there was a social structure in place and that you were considered somewhat expendable in that. But you had developed great trust with the king, so that he trusted you to be that last person between the food that he ate and himself and the queen. And so in that regard, in that respect, Nehemiah is going to use this position of influence, and he's going to lead someone who is even above him in society. And so this powerful king is going to be influenced by the cupbearer, Nehemiah, because Nehemiah has gone to the Lord in prayer. He has prayed for success. In fact, he prays that God will give him success today. That's the prayer that we look at in chapter 1. And so as we begin in chapter 2, we see that in the very first part of chapter 2, Nehemiah says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. That's where we begin the story. And it would be easy for us to just gloss over that and move on to the next thing. But I want you to notice this. In the month of Nisan, now we know from the very first chapter, he tells us that it was the month of Kislev when the people came to him. Kislev is November, December time frame. Nisan is March, April time frame. So 4 months have gone by after Nehemiah has prayed to the God of heaven and said, grant me success today. He prays and nothing seems to happen for 4 months because he doesn't have an opportunity or take the opportunity or however things unfolded. We don't know. But whatever it was, we know that it was 4 months between the time that he hears this word and he develops this burden and he begins to pray and the time when he's actually going to take this really significant step to go before the king and say what he needs to say in order to accomplish what he knows God has called him to do. And so that's what he does. And he goes to the king. He has the wine as the cupbearer and he brings it to him and he gives it to the king. And it says at the end of verse 1, I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. That's the last line of verse 2. I was very much afraid. Why was Nehemiah afraid? Because when you went into the presence of the king, you were expected to put on your happy face and be happy. If a subject of the king wasn't happy, it tended to reflect poorly in the eyes of the king on his own leadership. And so the king wanted people to come before him, leave their cares behind because they were not as important as what the king had going on. And they needed to put their happy face on and be happy in the presence of the king and show him the respect and honor that he expected to receive. And so Nehemiah comes to him, gives him this wine, hasn't been sad in front of him before, because that would have been socially, that would not have been a good thing. And the king recognizes that and shows him some grace, says, why are you sad? This is nothing but sadness of heart. And Nehemiah is very much afraid because he does not know at this point, is the king going to listen to what he has to say, or is the king going to be outraged that Nehemiah has had the audacity to show up in his presence with sadness of face? And so he says, I was very much afraid, but verse 3, I said to the king, may the king live forever. That's always a good thing to say to the king. And so that's what Nehemiah says. He wants him to know right off the bat, this doesn't have to do with you, with my relationship to you in the sense that I'm dissatisfied or unhappy with you in any way. Hey, may you live forever. But he says, why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? He has a question for the king, and he words it in such a way that even the king can identify with it. He doesn't say, look, I want to go back to Jerusalem and I want to rebuild this wall that has been broken down and the city is in disgrace. And one of the reasons that he would have been afraid is because this very king had stopped work on the rebuilding of Jerusalem years before. And so this king they had gotten to a point where they had started to rebuild, and then there came some opposition, and there was some fear that maybe these people were trying to rebuild and maybe there would be some sort of overthrow and they would try to rebel against the king. And so the king back in the day had said, okay, no more. Let's put a stop to this. So Nehemiah is now coming back in the presence of this same man. Think about the scene that's around this. If this were a movie, then you would just see evidence of status and power and wealth as Nehemiah marches in, gives the wine to the king, presents it to the king, and stands before him in the presence of this great world empire leader and says to him, hey, why shouldn't I be sad? Because my city, the city of my ancestors, where they're buried, lies in ruins. Well, the king's going to be able to identify with that. The king has a family and he understands the importance of ancestry and the nation of your birth and all of those, the country of your birth and all of those things. And he's going to identify with that. And so the king says, what is it that you want? He recognizes immediately that there's more to this than just Nehemiah showing up and being sad and being, a little bit melancholy over the fact that the city of his ancestors lies in ruins. He knows that Nehemiah has some sort of plan. And so Nehemiah says at the very end of verse 4, "Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king." Underline that. What a great image of prayer. I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. Nehemiah has been waiting 4 months to approach the king with his request. And when he gets the time and the chance to do that, and he begins this conversation, he's afraid. He's taking a risk. He knows that. The king says, "What is it that you want?" And Nehemiah says to us, "I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king." Nehemiah could not have, in that moment, gone to the king and said, "Well, king, I'm just going to need some time because I need a few minutes to get away. Have you got a quiet place? Maybe I could have an extended time of prayer, and then I'll come back and answer you." No, Nehemiah had to, in that moment, and because he had prepared earlier for what he wanted God to do and what he was praying for God to do and how he was hoping that God would work and how he was trusting in God's provision and God's providence in his life, because of all of that had gone on before in the background, because of all of those things, he was able to approach the king with confidence. And when the time came, he still recognized, I may be in this incredible palace with all of these trappings of wealth and power and prestige and status, but I'm standing before the king, but I'm standing before the Lord. And I'm going to pray to the God of heaven no matter what my circumstances are around me, no matter what it looks like as I look around. I'm not going to be distracted by those things. I'm going to look to the God of heaven. And in that moment, because he had cultivated in his life a spirit of prayer, that he had taken opportunities before to prepare and to pray. And he knew that what he needed most as he stood before this powerful leader of this world empire, what he needed most was the help of the King of the universe and the Lord and the God of heaven. And so he prays to the God of heaven and he answers the king. And I love the picture of that as it relates in our own lives, because there are times, and should be times, there were times in the life of Jesus when he got away, when he went away and found a place where he could escape from the public pressures and the life that he was living, and he could get away and have time alone with the Lord. And you see that in the lives of people throughout time who have escaped and found solitude and rest and refreshment and been replenished and saw a resurgence in their faith because of what God did in their private times alone. So that when he comes to this huge moment in his life, this is really a moment of truth. He's standing before the king. There's a huge question mark over the top of what's going to happen here. Is the king going to look favorably on this? Is he going to look unfavorably on this? Is it going to cost me my life? Is it going to cost me everything? Am I going to find the success that I've prayed for since I first heard about this need? And he can't just say, I've got to get away. He's got to say, in this moment, even right here, standing in front of the king, I'm going to have a spirit of prayer. That I'm just going to have to pray to the God of heaven, and I'm going to have to give an answer. But because I've prayed to the God of heaven, when it was my first response, this is not just a last resort emergency prayer. Oh Lord, I'm in great danger and great need right now. Please help me. He's come to a place where in faith and trust, he knows that he can pray to the God of heaven in this moment that's packed with pressure, and he doesn't know how the king is going to respond, but he knows that the God of heaven is with him and he can answer the king. And so that's what he does. And he answers the king and he says, verse 5, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, Let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. Nehemiah is ready when the king answers him. And so when the king asks him the question, Nehemiah says to him, "If it pleases you, and if I found favor, let me go to this place where my ancestors are buried." He still hasn't named the city of Jerusalem, but they both know where he's talking about going. He's talking about going back to a place where this king has forbidden work to continue in years past. And so the king, with the queen, Nehemiah says, sitting beside the king, says, "How long are you going to take? Because I want you back here." Nehemiah has proven himself as a leader, as a trusted confidant to the king, so that the king says, "I'd like to have you come back to continue. You've proven yourself in this role that you are in now. I'd like to see you continue in this role, but I'm going to grant your request because of the goodwill that I have for you." And so the king says, "You can go, let me know." And Nehemiah says, "I set a time and told him when my plan was to be back." But then Nehemiah says this in verse 7, "I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy." And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. Nehemiah had a plan. Nehemiah had clearly thought through, what will I say if the king says yes? No doubt he had given thought to the consequences of if the king said no, or if the king became angry. That was one reason that Nehemiah was afraid when he approached the king. He didn't know how it was going to turn out, but Nehemiah was trusting in God through this whole process, that even when he faced an uncertain future, he knew that he could trust God in this moment. And so he asked the king. Now imagine what he's done now. So not only has he gone before the king and said, "Hey, can I go and rebuild this city that you have forbidden work to continue on in years past?" Not only has he asked that, which the king says, "Okay, you can go." And Nehemiah then says, "Okay, will you pay for it?" Because he tells the king, could I have these letters? Will you guarantee my safety in arriving there? And then will you finance this deal by providing timber from the royal forest to build the walls and the citadel by the temple, and even for the house? I'm going to need a place to live while they're there. Nehemiah has spent part of his time. His time spent waiting was not spent wasted. His waiting time was not wasted time. And for us, I think that's a great lesson. Time spent waiting doesn't have to be time spent that's wasted. And so Nehemiah has made the most of his time. He's thought about, if the king says yes, here's what I'm going to need. He's thought about the possibilities of what could be. God has given him this vision, and as he thinks about what's going to happen in the future, he knows that, well, here's some things. If the king says yes, I need to be ready to ask these things. It won't do me any good to walk out of the presence of the king and leave, and while I'm on my way to Jerusalem, to think, oh, you know what? I should have asked about this. I should have asked about that. I should have asked the king if he'd pay for this whole thing. Instead, Nehemiah is prepared. His faith in God does not preclude him, does not keep him from preparing for what God's will is going to involve in his future. Faith and preparation aren't opposites. Nehemiah doesn't say, well, if he gives me permission, then I'll just go. We'll figure out the rest later. God will provide for us. God has provided for him by giving him waiting time in this 4-month interval. and in the time that he spends leading up to his encounter with the king, to plan out and to prepare what he might need, so that in this moment of truth, when he's standing in front of the king, that he can say to him, here's what I need, and here's where we need to think about. I'm going to need to have safe passage. If I have a letter from the king, I'm not going to be bothered by anybody along the way, because they're not going to dare oppose the king's blessing. And if the king has given me his blessing and said, basically, I endorse Nehemiah to go on this trip, and I want everyone along the way to know that, Nehemiah knows that's an important piece of his journey. That's an important part of the plan that God has provided. That's the way God is going to allow him to have this provision for a safe journey, is by having this letter and having the wisdom and the foresight to ask for this letter so that he can have it at a moment's notice. If he comes into somebody along the road who wants to challenge his reason for being there or wants to bring harm to him, then he can say, hey, I've got this letter from the king. The king wants me to go. The king allows me to go. The king says that I'm going on his endorsement. And so the king does that for him. And then Nehemiah also says, once I get there, I'm going to need some things. And he's even thought about his own dwelling place. He's thought about the walls of the city, how much wood they're going to need. And so he asked the king for all of those things. And even in doing that, I think it's important for us to note that even in his planning and his preparation, he doesn't take credit for the result. Notice how he says, because the gracious hand of God was upon me, then he granted my request. The king granted my request. And the reason the king granted my request is not because I'm such a great person and I've thought this whole thing through and I've sort of gone to the king and manipulated him in any way. The reason the king has granted my request is because the gracious hand of God was upon me. And because the gracious hand of God is upon us, we can go with confidence to achieve the things that we know that he's called us to do, that we can live our lives in a way that says the gracious hand of God is upon me in good times, in challenging times, in times when we are spending time waiting, in times when it seems like everything's happening at once and we're throwing up prayers right and left because things are happening so fast and we're just having to make one decision after another. So for Nehemiah, it was important for him to note in his memoir, which is basically what this is as he recounts what has happened, for him to say, because the gracious hand of my God was upon me. And so the phrases that really stand out to me in this passage are these: I prayed to the God of heaven and I answered the king. In a moment, I prayed to the God of heaven and I answered the king. And then for him to say, the gracious hand of my God was on me and the king granted my request. That in Nehemiah's life, he had spent time waiting and he had spent time praying and he had spent time planning and he had spent time preparing and he knew what he wanted to do and he was still dependent on God to see it come about and to see it all begin to come to fruition. And he was ready to do what he needed to do and what he was being called to do. I hope that as you discuss these questions and think about this, you'll ask yourself this big question: what will I do? What am I doing while I'm waiting? And I hope the answer to that is that you're finding ways through the reading of Scripture, through growing closer to Jesus in your walk with Him, through memorizing Scripture, through studying in God's Word with other people, through the community that we have developed here, and through your involvement in your local church, that in all of those ways that you are growing closer to God and that you are discovering and uncovering His will for you as you take steps day by day to be obedient, to walk with Him, and to understand that He is opening doors all along the way, just as He did for Nehemiah, to be the cupbearer, to be the person who's in this place of influence, to meet before the king, to be granted the king's favor, that Nehemiah is just walking through open doors, one after another, following God's will for him. He doesn't know how it's going to end or what it's going to look like, but as best he can, he's making plans and preparing and knowing that whatever it is that God calls him to do, that God's gracious hand is going to be on him. I pray that you have a great time of discussion. I I pray that you have a great week, and I hope to see you again next week.